The Eastern Gate, Edessa, before the fall. You've heard of Jerusalem, you've heard of Antioch, of knights in gleaming armor, of kings shouting Deus Vult beneath the blazing sun. But this story begins elsewhere, not in glory, not in triumph, but in a place most have forgotten, a city at the edge of the world, where stone met sand and hope held on by a thread. Its name was Edessa, and its fall would shake Christendom to its knees. Edessa was never meant to be a kingdom. It wasn't grand like Jerusalem. It didn't have the relics, the cathedrals, the choirs of Latin priests. What it had was position, a gate, a wedge between east and west, a frontier, and frontiers bleed. When the First Crusade surged through Anatolia and down toward the Holy Land, Baldwin of Boulogne, younger brother of Godfrey of Bouillon, split from the main army. He didn't want to follow, he wanted to rule. So he turned east, to a land of Armenians, Syriacs, Arabs where loyalties were paper thin, and swords spoke louder than oaths. He saw opportunity, and in 1098 he seized it. With cunning and coercion, Baldwin inserted himself into Edessa's noble line. He was adopted by Thoros. The aging Armenian ruler then conveniently succeeded him weeks later after a sudden, bloody rebellion. Thoros was strangled. Baldwin became count, and Edessa became the first Crusader state before Jerusalem, before Antioch, before all the rest. But Baldwin didn't stay. Within a year, he left for greater glory, ascending as king of Jerusalem after his brother's death. Edessa, he left in the hands of deputies, men like Baldwin II and Jocelyn of Courtenay, men who could fight, but not unite. Edessa was surrounded north by the Seljuks, east by Mosul, south by Aleppo. Allies were far, enemies were near, and the city itself vulnerable, flat, exposed, built for commerce, not war, but it endured. For decades, Edessa stood because its rulers were ruthless and its people resilient. The Franks intermarried with Armenian nobles. They built alliances with Kurdish warlords. They played politics like chess, bribing one emir while threatening another. Yet cracks appeared. By the 1140s, Edessa had grown weak. Baldwin II was long gone. Jocelyn II now held the city charming, ambitious, but reckless. He fought with Antioch, distrusted Jerusalem, ignored warnings. His army was small, his coffers strained, and worst of all, he believed Edessa was safe. But east of the Euphrates, something stirred. A man named Zengi, Atabeg of Mosul, lord of Aleppo, a warrior hardened by siege and betrayal. He saw what the Franks had built and knew it could be broken. He watched Edessa and waited until one winter's night, when Jocelyn left the city with most of his knights off to argue, to ally, to chase phantom threats, and Edessa lay nearly unguarded. The trap was set. The world had forgotten Edessa, but Zengi had not, and the storm was coming. To understand why Edessa fell, you must understand the man who held it. Jocelyn II, Count of Edessa, a man born of war. His father, Jocelyn Io, had fought alongside Baldwin II and carved a realm from dust and blood. He taught his son courage, pride, and one fatal lesson. Never trust anyone fully, even your own kind. Jocelyn II took that lesson to heart. He trusted no one, not the Armenians, whose loyalty he considered mercurial, not the Greeks, whom he saw as cowardly schemers, not the other Crusader states, especially not Raymond of Antioch, whose ambitions rivaled his own, and certainly not the Byzantines, whom he openly insulted at every turn. But Edessa was no longer a prize. It was a burden. Unlike the fertile lands of Tripoli or the trade routes of Jerusalem, Edessa offered little beyond danger. Its people, Armenian Christians, Arab traders, Syriac monks spoke in tongues Jocelyn barely understood. Its nobles resented foreign rule. Its walls were crumbling, and its coffers ran dry. Yet Jocelyn believed himself invincible. He relied on what remained of his father's alliances, blind to the shifting tide around him. In Antioch, Prince Raymond played his own games, courting Byzantium one day, defying them the next. In Jerusalem, King Fulk, a former Count of Anjou, sought to strengthen ties with Byzantium to the south and keep Tripoli in check. No one had time or patience for Edessa, and Jocelyn knew it. So he turned inward. He raised taxes, enforced harsh military levies, fortified castles far from the city while ignoring the city itself. When Armenian lords grumbled, he sent soldiers. When monks protested, he expelled them. But the threat did not lie within. It lay beyond the river. Zengi, the name whispered like a curse in the taverns of Aleppo and the alleys of Mosul. A man with no patience for disunity. He had crushed rebellious emirs, stormed fortress after fortress, and proclaimed himself protector of Islam not just in word, but in fire. Unlike other Muslim rulers fractured by family feuds and tribal rivalries, Zengi united under him. The idea of jihad against the Franks was not just religious, it was personal. He saw what the Crusaders had done, how they had torn into the heart of Dar al-Islam, desecrated cities, split communities, and crowned kings over holy land. Edessa was an insult, an exposed outpost Christian, isolated, arrogant. Zengi bided his time. He struck where the Franks expected least, then vanished. He tested Edessa's defenses, then retreated. He sent spies into the city, some disguised as monks, others as traders. They took stock of the guard posts, the food stores, the mood of the people, and they found what he hoped for, divided loyalties. Cracking morale, a ruler growing increasingly distant from his own walls. Then came the moment. In late 1144, Jocelyn marched west, seeking to forge an alliance with the Artukids, Muslim rivals of Zengi. He brought with him nearly all of Edessa's standing knights. He believed Zengi was occupied to the north. He believed Edessa would stand in his absence. He believed wrong. Zengi moved fast. With 20,000 men, archers, siege engineers, tribal cavalry, mercenaries. He crossed the Euphrates before word even reached Antioch. He surrounded Edessa in days. The city's gates were shut, but the panic had already begun. The defenders were few, the walls old and crumbling, the siege engines outdated. There were women and children in the streets, old men clutching rusted swords, priests holding up relics and chanting liturgies in Latin and Armenian. Panic spread like fire. Zengi's men built siege towers, dug trenches, pounded the gates day and night. The defenders fought valiantly, but they knew no reinforcements would come. Jocelyn was too far, Antioch too reluctant, Jerusalem too preoccupied. Edessa was alone. And as the sun rose on the 24th of December, the walls broke, and the nightmare began. The walls did not fall quietly. They cracked like thunderstones shaken loose by weeks of pounding, mortar crumbling under the relentless weight of Zengi's siege engines. Flames licked the sky where the towers once stood, and into the breach surged a tide of fury. Zengi's soldiers poured through like a river of steel. Archers took to the roofs. Axemen hacked through doors. The narrow streets of Edessa, once filled with pilgrims and market vendors, became rivers of blood. The massacre was methodical. Men were cut down where they stood, priests at altars, guards at gates, fathers shielding children. Women were dragged screaming from homes. Churches became slaughterhouses. The Cathedral of St. Theodore, once a place of solemn liturgy, now echoed with the sound of screams and splintering wood. Those who ran found no sanctuary. Those who hid were smoked out. Zengi had ordered it no mercy. Edessa was not to be taken, it was to be punished. Because this was not just conquest, it was a message. To the Crusaders, your kingdom is not untouchable. To the Muslims of the region, unity brings victory. To history, the tide had turned. By nightfall, the cross no longer flew over Edessa. Its towers bore Zengi's standard black with golden calligraphy, fluttering over a city in ruin. Some residents were taken as slaves, marched in chains eastward. Others were killed outright, especially Latins and Frankish settlers. Armenian Christians, while spared the worst, suffered under looting and displacement. The city's ancient Syriac community, who had lived there long before Rome or Islam, watched helplessly as their world burned again. Jocelyn too returned days later to ashes and silence. Too late to save, too proud to grieve. He rallied survivors, built up defences in the nearby fortress of Turbisal, but Edessa itself was lost. It was the first Crusader city to fall, and it would not be the last. News spread like fire through the Levant, then across the sea, in Antioch. Panic, in Tripoli. Fear, in Jerusalem. Disbelief. How could it fall? How could a city blessed by the blood of martyrs, secured by noble oaths, protected by Christendom, be wiped out so swiftly? In Rome, the Pope wept. In France, the bells tolled. And in every cathedral from Canterbury to Cologne, preachers raised their voices once more. Not in mourning, but in rallying. Because if one city could fall, then all could. And so began the storm that would follow the Second Crusade, born not of triumph, but of vengeance, not of unity, but of desperation. But that is a story for another time. For now, Edessa smoulders. Its people scattered, its name forever remembered not as the first Crusader state, but the first to be lost. In the aftermath, the land changed. Edessa no longer marked the eastern edge of Latin Christendom. It became its bleeding wound, a once promising outpost, now a cautionary tale. The churches that still stood were silent, emptied of relics and riddled with arrows. The graveyards, too full. The living, too broken. But Edessa's fall did more than mark a loss. It shattered an illusion. For decades, Europeans had believed their Crusader states divinely protected. The victories of the First Crusade were etched into legend miraculous, ordained, final. But Zengi's conquest proved otherwise. God had not guaranteed them victory, not forever. And that realization tore through Christendom like a storm. In every court and monastery, questions began to surface. Had they sinned? Had they grown soft? Was Edessa lost because of politics or because of pride? Meanwhile, in the east, Zengi was hailed as a second Khalid ibn al-Walid, a unifier of Muslims, a scourge of the Franks. Poets praised him. Muezzins thanked Allah from minarets. The idea of jihad was no longer abstract. It had found its sword. But Zengi, too, would not last. Months after his greatest triumph, he was murdered by a slave in his sleep. Poisoned. Some whispered, betrayed. Others said, his death sent his realm into uncertainty. Yet his shadow remained. And it would be his son, Nur ad-Din, who would take the torch forward. He would preach not only war, but justice. Not only conquest, but reform. He would gather scholars and soldiers alike under a single banner and teach a young man named Yusuf ibn Ayyub, whom history would remember as Saladin. And so, from the ashes of Edessa, the future was born. A future not of fragile kingdoms and isolated castles, but of empires, counter-crusades, and a new generation of holy warriors. Because what fell in Edessa was not just a city, it was the illusion of permanence, the notion that faith alone could hold stone against storm. And as smoke rose into the eastern sky, the West prepared to answer. As Europe reeled from the news of Edessa's fall, the emotional aftershocks swept not just through royal courts and papal palaces, but through the very hearts of peasants, merchants, and monks who had once believed that the Crusader kingdoms were God's unshakable citadels on earth. Songs once sung in taverns about the glory of Jerusalem turned somber. Pilgrimages were cancelled. Donations to crusading causes dropped. And yet, amid the grief, something darker took root, a hunger for vengeance, and a renewed cry to take up the cross once more. Pope Eugenius III, newly installed and under immense pressure, acted swiftly. He issued a papal bull Quantum Predecessoris, a document as urgent as it was sweeping. It reminded the faithful of the triumphs of their fathers, the miracle of the First Crusade, and called upon all Christian rulers, nobles, and common men to rise again in the name of Christ and reclaim what was lost. But this was not the same Europe that had answered Urban II's call in 1095. A generation had passed. The world had changed. Politics had hardened. Cynicism had crept in. Still, the flame caught. In France, a devout and guilt-ridden king named Louis VII saw in the fall of Edessa not just a geopolitical crisis, but a divine sign. He had been plagued with remorse over the burning of a church in Vitry during a civil war. Perhaps now, he thought, God was offering him a path to atonement. When the famed preacher Bernard of Clairvaux, the most powerful moral voice in Christendom, came to speak in Vézelay, thousands gathered in the cold. He spoke not of borders, but of souls. He painted the fall of Edessa as a wound to Christ himself. Witnesses say the crowds wept openly. Crosses were cut from cloaks. The Second Crusade had begun in Germany. Conrad III, Holy Roman Emperor, followed suit, reluctantly at first, pressured by nobles and the church alike. It was the first time in history that two reigning monarchs of Christendom would march together to the Holy Land. The scale of the response was unprecedented. Tens of thousands pledged themselves to the cause. Logistics were set in motion, ships commissioned, taxes levied. But for all its grandeur, the movement was already carrying the seeds of disaster. Because unlike the First Crusade, the Second was driven less by desperation and more by political rivalry and national pride. Louis and Conrad distrusted each other deeply. Their armies marched separately through treacherous terrain in Anatolia, where ambushes by the Seljuk Turks turned the journey into a nightmare. Supply lines collapsed. Command structures broke down. Thousands perished before even reaching the Levant. And Edessa, still in ruins. The Second Crusade never even reached it. Instead, diverted by diplomatic entanglements and poor intelligence, the Crusaders set their sights on Damascus, an ally of the Crusader states just a few years earlier. In 1148, they laid siege to the city, hoping for a symbolic victory. But the campaign was poorly planned, the terrain unfamiliar, and the defenders fierce. Within days, the siege was lifted in disgrace. The Crusaders limped back to Jerusalem, demoralized and divided. Their return to Europe was not met with fanfare, but with shame. Louis returned to France in silence. Conrad followed, his authority weakened. The Second Crusade had failed utterly, and Edessa forgotten. Left behind like a broken relic, its walls never rebuilt, its people never avenged. The county ceased to exist. In its place, Zengi's successors Nur ad-Din and eventually Saladin would carve out a powerful new Islamic resistance. For the Franks, the loss marked the beginning of a slow erosion. Trust between the Latin kingdoms weakened. Byzantine suspicion deepened. Muslim unity strengthened. The psychological blow of Edessa rippled far beyond its stone walls. But history has a strange rhythm. For while Edessa vanished from maps, its fall planted a seed of reckoning. A warning that the Crusader dream was not invincible, that even God's city, in the minds of many, could be torn down by mortal hands if pride and disunity were left unchecked. And that memory of a gate that fell in silence while kings argued would haunt Christendom, until another kingdom fell. until another city burned, until another call rang out, this time in the shadow of Saladin. The silence of Edessa became a wound not just on parchment maps, but on the very soul of Christendom. For the first time since Pope Urban's rallying cry at Clermont, there was doubt, not spoken aloud in pulpits or courts, but whispered in monasteries, at borders, in the back rooms of cathedrals. Had they misunderstood God's will? Was this a test or a punishment? Theologians scrambled to interpret the fall through scripture. Some said Edessa was sacrificed for pride, its rulers too consumed by ambition, too quick to scorn papal guidance, too entangled in Eastern politics. Others blamed the Armenians, the Byzantines, the infidels within. Some even dared suggest that the First Crusade had awakened something they could no longer control. A spiritual war turned into a human one, and thus tainted. But for the common man, the impact was more immediate. Those who had once given coin and sons for the Crusader cause began to hesitate. Merchants feared for trade routes. Pilgrims changed course. Artisans in Venice and Genoa, who had profited from the eastern ports, now whispered of instability. Even the Knights Templar, still young and growing, faced skepticism. If Edessa could fall, what stronghold was truly safe? And yet, for all the doubt, the idea of redemption through war still burned, especially in the minds of monarchs who feared irrelevance. The notion that Europe could once again be united, if not by politics, then by piety, was too powerful to ignore. So they pushed forward, not because they understood Edessa, but because they feared what it meant to do nothing. Meanwhile, in the east, Zengi's lieutenants divided the spoils and strengthened their grip. Edessa became a base, a launch point, a symbol. Where once the crescent had receded under Frankish banners, it now advanced with righteous vengeance. The people of Mosul and Aleppo, long at odds, began to speak of unity. The muezzins, who called the faithful to prayer, now added a new refrain: the Franks are not invincible. In the shattered halls of Edessa, old scrolls were burned, Latin inscriptions chiseled away. The cathedral, once rededicated to St. Thomas, now housed guards and horses. And yet, in the shadows, not all had fled. Syriac monks hid their manuscripts in clay jars. Armenians buried their dead in silence, beneath the olive groves outside the city. Not all resistance is loud. In the west, Bernard of Clairvaux travelled city to city, his voice fire, his presence electric. He reminded the crowds of Jerusalem, of the tomb, of sins that could be washed clean only by the taking up of arms. And while some wept and pledged, others hesitated. The war machine of faith was starting again, but the gears groaned, slower than before. Because Edessa had done something the First Crusade never did. It had shown Europe that they could lose, and not in distant abstract ways, but in stone, blood, and screams. A city gone, a people scattered, a faith questioned. The Second Crusade would be born of this fear, but it would not bring salvation. It would bring disappointment. And behind it, a man was watching. A boy, really, raised in the court of Nur ad-Din, taught that jihad was not a moment, but a mission. His name was Yusuf, and he would change everything. But for now, in the chill of a December night, Edessa was quiet, and the world had changed. And yet, history does not pause to grieve, even as the ruins of Edessa smouldered, as survivors wandered westward in rags, as monks copied their laments onto brittle parchment elsewhere. The wheels of fate turned. In Damascus, Nur ad-Din inherited his father's legacy, not just land and soldiers, but an idea. Zengi had shown the world that Crusader walls could fall. Now his son would take that idea further, not through brute force alone, but through reform, patience, and vision. He rebuilt schools and mosques. He recruited scholars and jurists. And above all, he preached unity, not as a slogan, but as a strategy, a unified Islam under God and sword. In the West, Louis VII's preparations intensified. He corresponded with the Byzantines, sought advice from Bernard, summoned nobles with oaths and gold. His queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, would accompany him, a rare and controversial decision that would sow chaos of its own. The journey to the east was no longer seen as a miracle, but a duty, or, to some, a curse waiting to repeat. Edessa had become a lesson, but few were learning the right one. They still thought this was a matter of armies, of banners and battles. But Edessa had not fallen because its walls were weak. It had fallen because its heart was divided. And that truth unlearned would echo across the deserts and seas, from the cold cathedrals of France to the golden domes of Jerusalem. As part one closes, we leave behind a broken city, a shaken faith, and the sound of war drums slowly rising again, because what fell at Edessa would rise in Damascus. And from those ashes, Saladin would come, somewhere in the rubble of Edessa. A child cried. No chronicles recorded his name. No knight stopped to ask who he had lost. His tears fell into dust that had once been altars, into the cracks of stones stained with centuries of prayer. That child was the future, not the kings, not the counts, not the preachers who rode through cities, but the ones left behind, witnesses without power, heirs to a war they never chose. The fall of Edessa did not end with broken gates or burning towers. Its legacy lingered in whispers, in the nightmares of fleeing monks, in the reluctant silence of pilgrims who passed by its ruins without stopping, in the fear that if Edessa could fall, so too could Antioch, so too could Jerusalem. It was no longer just about land, it was about the story that had once been so simple, good versus evil, cross versus crescent. But Edessa blurred that line. It showed how pride could betray faith, how politics could outweigh prayer, how walls mean nothing when hearts are hollow. For the Muslim world, Edessa was proof that God had not abandoned them, that their lands could be reclaimed, one city at a time, not through fury but through unity. Zengi's jihad was not just violence, it was vision, and from that vision would grow an idea larger than any emir or atabeg could imagine. And in the West, they still sang songs of Jerusalem, but now, with a little less certainty, a little more doubt, and somewhere, in the cold halls of a monastery, a young monk dipped his quill and wrote, "What God has given, man may still lose, and what man has built, God may yet tear down." Edessa had fallen, and with it, the age of illusions. The wind that moved through the ruins of Edessa carried more than dust. It carried memory sharp, bitter, and unfinished. In the West, chroniclers struggled to explain what had happened. Some blamed treachery. Others whispered of divine judgment. None could deny the sense that something irreversible had occurred. The fall of Edessa had not just redrawn borders, it had shaken belief. For decades, the Crusader states had stood as monuments to Christian resolve, as proof that God's favor rested upon their swords. Now, that myth lay in rubble. The Holy War, once bathed in triumphant certainty, now faced its first real shadow. And still, in cathedrals far from the front, bells rang not to mourn, but to summon. The memory of Edessa became fuel. Preachers invoked its loss with tears in their eyes and fury in their voices. "Will you let your brothers die in the east while you feast in the west?" they cried. Guilt turned to anger, anger to purpose. The cross was taken up again, not in hope this time, but in fear. Fear that what had been lost might never be regained. That the gates of heaven, once thought held open by knights and kings, were slowly closing, in taverns and courts. Edessa became a ghost, its story retold in wine-stained whispers, its streets reimagined as altars defiled, its people as martyrs. But few remembered what Edessa truly was: a fragile city on the edge of empire, ruled by division, left undefended. Its fall had not been swift divine punishment, nor tragic destiny. It had been the result of arrogance, neglect, and the cost of fractured unity. That lesson, though writ in blood, would go largely unheeded. Meanwhile, far to the east, Nur ad-Din prayed in Damascus. He had inherited his father's sword and vision, but he sought something greater: a world where Islam stood as one. He would build that world, not just with armies, but with law, learning, and the quiet, steady hand of reform. And in his court, a young officer listened carefully, observed, studied. His name was Yusuf, and one day, the West would call him Saladin. But all that was yet to come. For now, the roads to Edessa lay empty, the towers blackened, the crosses torn down, and in the silence that followed, two truths remained: that no city is ever truly safe, and no fall ever truly forgotten. As Edessa faded into history, its absence loomed larger than its presence ever had. Travelers passing the city's remains decades later would still describe the scorched foundations and the broken towers as if ghosts lingered there. Fragments of chants, of screams, of a world that tried to merge holiness with empire and failed. The Crusader dream had never felt more distant. In Rome, even as Pope Eugenius issued his second call to arms, some within the church began to question the machinery of holy war. Was the blood of peasants worth the politics of princes? Had the sword become too blunt, too blind? But these were dangerous thoughts, rarely voiced aloud. The momentum of faith and pride had already been set in motion. Too many had died to admit the cause itself might be flawed. And so, the project of salvation continued under banners, on ships, across mountains. The fall of Edessa had birthed a paradox proof of failure that became justification for more war. The Second Crusade, bloated with royalty and clerical ambition, would rise on the bones of Edessa not to reclaim it, but to restore an image of strength. But images, as Edessa proved, can be illusions. The Muslims, however, had seen something different in its fall, not just weakness, but a pattern they could disrupt. Nur ad-Din saw it clearly. While the Crusaders struggled to unify, he built a legacy of patient, ideological unity. He placed scholars beside generals, imams beside merchants, and began to shape Syria not just as a battleground, but as a civilization ready to withstand another century of wars, and quietly. This reshaping began to inspire a generation that would no longer tolerate foreign kings ruling from their cities. The Edessa that Baldwin claimed had been forged in ambition and held together by treaties and tribute. The Edessa that Zengi shattered had exposed the thin seams of Latin rule in the East. But the Edessa that endured in memory, in legend, became a turning point, a marker in the sand where East began to rise and West began to stumble. In the shadows of its ruined gate, a question was left behind. If a city built in the name of God can be erased by men, what does that say about the men and about the God they claimed to serve? That question would haunt kings, popes, and warriors for generations. And as the drums of the next crusade began to thunder, the world unknowingly entered a darker, more complex chapter 1, not of conquest, but of reckoning. The siege begins, treachery and collapse. The winter of 1144 arrived not with snow, but with silence, and that silence was the loudest omen of all. Edessa, once bustling with market cries and the slow clang of cathedral bells, now stood exposed beneath a grey and heavy sky. Its walls, weathered and patched, circled the city like a prayer half-whispered and forgotten. Inside, the people went about their routines with anxious eyes and ears tuned to rumour. The Count, Jocelyn's second, was gone, marching west with his best knights, chasing an alliance, chasing relevance. He had done this before. He had always returned. The city had always endured. But this time, something was different. Across the river, in the shadowed lands of Mosul and Aleppo, the men of Zengi were moving, quietly, efficiently, with purpose sharpened by patience. Zengi, the Atabeg of Mosul, had waited for years, not because he was weak, but because he was wise. He knew Edessa's weakness was not its stone, but its solitude. And now, with Jocelyn gone, with no reinforcements on the horizon, the hour had come. By the time the first sentries spotted movement on the eastern banks, it was already too late. 20,000 troops, hardened veterans and tribal auxiliaries alike, encircled Edessa in less than 3 days. Siege engines were raised with terrifying speed. Archers took positions on nearby ridges. Tunnels were dug beneath the walls, where fire would be set to bring down their very foundations. The city was not under siege. It was already in the jaws of the beast. Panic spread faster than orders. The remaining garrison, barely more than 1,000 men, scrambled to man the ramparts. Armenian militia, Latin knights, even priests with spears stood side by side, watching as the horizon turned black with banners. Mothers gathered children into the cellars of churches. Merchants tried desperately to hide their wares. In the cathedral, relics were kissed, hymns whispered, confessions murmured like desperate spells. Inside the walls, hope decayed by the hour. Outside, Zengi made no grand speeches. He gave no ultimatums. This was not about glory. It was about message. Edessa had been the first Crusader state. It would now be the first to fall. And it would fall not in days but in agony. Inside Edessa, time unraveled. Hours passed like days. From the watchtowers, the defenders could see the silhouettes of Zengi's siege towers growing taller with each sunrise. Monstrous scaffolds of timber and ambition, wheeled forward slowly but relentlessly. By the 4th day, their creaking became as familiar as the morning call to prayer. Edessa's citizens Armenians, Syriacs, Latins began to count their breaths by the groans of wood and the thud of battering rams. The city's leadership, what little remained, splintered almost instantly. Some urged negotiation, others swore resistance. Bishop Basil of Edessa called for divine intervention and ordered mass vigils to be held daily in the cathedral, where relics of the saints were paraded through the streets. But even the most devout saw that prayers could not stop stones. Supplies dwindled. The well in the eastern quarter ran dry. Rats disappeared. Soon, children were being fed broth made from shoe leather and dried herbs. The soldiers, those who had remained, fought valiantly. Each breach in the wall was patched with desperation and cloth. They poured boiling oil from ramparts, loosed arrows until their fingers bled. But every sortie failed. Every counterattack lost men. They were not trained for a siege, and they were not meant to win. Zengi's men, on the other hand, moved like clockwork. His engineers, veterans of the Aleppo campaigns, rotated shifts with brutal discipline. The tunnels beneath the city walls grew longer, reinforced with timber and lined with flammable pitch. Their goal was not to simply breach Edessa, it was to collapse it from within. At night, the torchlight shimmered on their helmets like embers of some vast, inevitable furnace. Among the population, fear turned inward. Rumors of betrayal spread like infection. Was the western gate unlocked at night? Had Armenian merchants bribed the guards to secure safe passage? Some said the bishop was negotiating secretly with the enemy. Others accused the Syriacs of cowardice. A city that once united under a single cross, now fractured beneath it. Jocelyn II, upon hearing of the siege, turned back, but the distance was vast, and his forces too few. He sent riders to Antioch, but Raymond delayed. He sent word to Jerusalem, but winter storms slowed every messenger. Days turned to weeks. The cries from Edessa's towers were drowned by the clash of catapults and the moans of dying men. Then, on December 23rd, the mines succeeded. A massive section of the eastern wall collapsed in a storm of smoke and stone. Zengi's troops surged into the breach with terrifying precision. The defenders tried to rally clergy armed with swords, housewives with knives, aging soldiers with trembling hands. But it was over, street by street. Edessa was taken. Blood slicked the marble floors of the cathedral. The market square, once filled with spice traders and silk tents, became a battlefield. Churches burned, icons shattered. The screams of the wounded mixed with the shouts of the victors. No mercy was shown to the Latin Christians. Men were executed in the streets. Women and children taken captive. The Armenians and Syriacs fared slightly better. Zengi had political reasons for keeping their communities intact, but they too suffered loss, looting, and ruin. By the next morning, Zengi stood atop the citadel. His banner, a black field inscribed with golden verses from the Quran, rose above the battered skyline. The First Crusader state had fallen. There were no final speeches, no parades, just the wind, heavy with ash and mourning, whistling through what had once been Edessa's proud arches. And in its echo, the West heard only one thing, that something holy had been taken from them, and it must be reclaimed, no matter the cost. News of Edessa's fall travelled westward like a plague. It crossed the Anatolian plateau on the lips of broken survivors. It crept through the halls of Antioch with bitter whispers. It reached the shores of Cyprus on blood-stained sails. And when it landed in Europe, first in Venice, then in Rome, and finally in Paris, it hit with the force of revelation. Not since the capture of Jerusalem had a city so central to the Crusader myth been lost. But where Jerusalem had symbolized glory, Edessa now screamed failure. The Pope, Eugenius III, was reportedly pale upon hearing the full details. Some say he wept, others say he collapsed, but all agree he acted. In the spring of 1145, he issued Quantum Predecessores, the papal bull that would ignite the Second Crusade. Its tone was urgent, almost desperate. It reminded the faithful of their forefathers' victories, how God had rewarded their courage with Jerusalem. It urged kings and peasants alike to rise again, for the cross, for vengeance, and for the preservation of Christendom's eastern flank. And unlike before, this crusade would not be led by minor nobles or wandering zealots. This time, it would be royalty, King Louis VII of France, tormented by guilt over the massacre at Vitry and eager for redemption, took the cross with theatrical devotion. His court erupted in a mixture of awe and uncertainty. His queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, brilliant, proud, and dangerously ambitious, demanded to accompany him. Their marriage would never recover. But for now, France marched. In Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III followed suit. Though older, more cautious, and less loved, he could not allow France to claim spiritual dominance. His acceptance was more political than pious. Yet it gave the Crusades something it had never had before: two kings, two armies, and a continent stirred once more into holy motion. But what the people of Europe remembered of the First Crusade was not the politics. It was the miracles. The walls falling at Antioch, the barefoot knights at Jerusalem. The God wills it echoed from town to town. So they responded in droves: peasants, knights, debtors, mercenaries. Cities emptied, fields were left unploughed. Families wept both with fear and pride as fathers and sons pledged themselves to the cause. Yet this movement, for all its size, carried an unspoken rot. The fire was there, but the unity was not. France and Germany would not march as one. The Byzantines, weary of Latin pride and betrayal, watched warily, and the Crusader states, instead of preparing for support, bickered among themselves, divided between jealousy and fear. Jocelyn II, displaced from Edessa and clinging to scraps of power, found little sympathy. The nobles of Antioch and Tripoli focused on their own borders, their own titles, their own intrigue. Still, the crusade gathered, not because of a vision, but because of a wound. And no one seemed to realize that marching towards salvation with a festering infection was a perilous thing. By the time the first ships sailed and the first banners fluttered over Alpine passes, the momentum of the Second Crusade had become unstoppable. And yet, even in its earliest days, cracks were visible thin, hairline fractures of pride and mistrust. In Louis VII's court, arguments broke out between northern and southern lords over precedents and provisions. German nobles looked down on their French counterparts as effeminate and undisciplined. French knights mocked the Germans as brutish and arrogant. Neither king trusted the other, and both underestimated the journey ahead. When the armies finally entered Byzantine territory, the tension worsened. Emperor Manuel Komnenos received them not as honored brothers in arms, but as potential threats. He had not forgotten how the First Crusade had ransacked Constantinople's outskirts, nor how Western arrogance had treated the Eastern Church as second class. To Louis and Conrad, the Byzantines were untrustworthy Greeks, too diplomatic to be warriors. To Manuel, they were undisciplined barbarians with crosses on their shields and conquest in their hearts. The Crusaders expected warm welcomes. They received half-hearted guides and heavily monitored passage. Food was scarce, prices soared, and rumors of Byzantine treachery spread quickly, rumors that would soon become prophecy. Conrad's German army, impatient and proud, insisted on marching ahead. They entered Anatolia without proper supplies, against Manuel's advice, and directly into Seljuk ambushes. What followed was not battle, it was butchery. The narrow passes became slaughterhouses. Arrows rained from cliffs. Horses slipped on gravel soaked in blood. Discipline collapsed. By the time Conrad limped back to Nicaea with the tattered remnants of his once mighty force, the Second Crusade had lost its first army. Louis fared little better. His army, too, was harried by terrain, betrayal, and hunger. His leadership, more symbolic than strategic, failed to keep order. Entire divisions broke away to plunder villages. Morale withered. When Eleanor insisted on traveling with her own Aquitanian entourage, some of them dressed more like nobles on parade than warriors in a campaign, the friction grew unbearable. Some blamed her for the chaos. Others whispered that she and her uncle Raymond of Antioch had their own plans. When the remnants of both royal armies finally reached Antioch, what remained of the crusade was not a united force. It was a mob of tired men, fraying alliances and rotting logistics, and Edessa, still in ruins. No one even discussed retaking it anymore. Instead, attention turned to a new target, Damascus, a once allied city, now deemed more attainable, more strategic. And so, with the cause already adrift, the Crusaders decided to gamble what remained of their strength on a siege no one had planned, and that many did not understand. The Second Crusade had begun in fire. It was about to end in smoke. The march to Damascus was not driven by strategy, but by desperation. The city, once a tenuous ally of the Crusader states against Zengi's expansion, had become politically isolated. Some in Jerusalem's court whispered that seizing Damascus would create a buffer, a new stronghold to replace Edessa. Others saw it simply as a chance, any chance for the Second Crusade to claim a victory before it collapsed entirely under the weight of its own expectations. But the decision was rushed, almost panicked. The Crusader leaders failed to coordinate with each other or with their local allies. Raymond of Poitiers, the Prince of Antioch and uncle to Eleanor of Aquitaine, refused to commit forces, embittered by Louis VII's refusal to help him in the north. The barons of Jerusalem, distrustful of foreign kings and still reeling from internal power struggles, gave only partial support, and the Muslim world, though fractured, was not blind. The siege of Damascus began in late July 1148. At first, things looked promising. The Crusader army approached from the west, cutting through orchards and seizing outer gardens. These green belts were Damascus's first line of defense, both a food source and a buffer. For a moment, it seemed the Christians might repeat the miracle of Jerusalem. But within 3 days, everything began to fall apart. The terrain was unfamiliar. The Crusaders had no map, no understanding of the irrigation systems or the fortified gates. The Damascene defenders, led by Mu'in ad-Din Unur, proved cunning and disciplined. They launched hit-and-run attacks from narrow alleys. They sabotaged wells and poisoned reservoirs. And above all, they held the eastern walls far more securely than the Crusaders expected. Then came the worst mistake of all. After failing to breach the western side, the Crusader leaders decided against all military logic to shift their entire force to the eastern approach. The move was slow, exposed, and disastrously visible. The defenders capitalized on the confusion. Arrows rained, panic spread. Dissent erupted among the Crusader ranks. Some claimed treachery from within. Others accused the Byzantines of withholding reinforcements. Still others blamed Eleanor and the Aquitanians, calling their presence a distraction cursed by God. On the 4th day, the siege was lifted, without glory, without gains, without honor. The army limped back, not to Edessa, not to Jerusalem, but back to the ports, to ships, to silence. Conrad III returned to Germany humiliated. Louis VII drifted in the Levant for another year, more pilgrim than warrior, before returning home to a shattered reputation and a dying marriage. The Second Crusade had begun as a divine mission and ended as a diplomatic embarrassment. For the first time, the Islamic world had not only resisted, but humiliated Christendom's mightiest kings on the battlefield. Zengi's dream had not died with him. It had become prophecy. The Franks were no longer invincible. And in the court of Nur ad-Din, in the hearts of warriors yet unborn, a truth was taking root. That God, too, watches the patient. In the aftermath of the failed siege, silence returned, but not peace. The roads that once carried Crusaders to Jerusalem now bore the weight of defeat. Horses limped, soldiers buried friends in shallow graves, priests, once triumphant with sermons of divine justice, now spoke in riddles about testing and mystery. The myth of Crusader destiny had not been broken, it had been undone, piece by piece, in the sands outside Damascus, Europe. When the survivors returned, greeted them not as heroes, but as disappointments. In Paris, Louis was met with cold ceremony. In Germany, Conrad's authority weakened under the strain of failure. Pope Eugenius III, unable to justify the loss, remained quiet. Even Bernard of Clairvaux, whose preaching had inspired tens of thousands to march, found himself under siege not by Muslims, but by his own guilt. In his letters, Bernard tried to explain the catastrophe. Who are we to question the will of God, he wrote. But the people did question. They questioned the church, the kings, the very notion that crusading was sacred. Donations dried, recruitment stalled, and in villages once swept up by the fire of holy war, now there were only ashes and widows. And yet, the East did not rest. Nur ad-Din, son of Zengi, took the victory not as a moment of triumph, but as a mantle of responsibility. He strengthened Aleppo and Damascus. He built schools and hospitals. He fostered an image not just of a warlord, but of a just ruler, a servant of Islam, not its master. His vision was long. He spoke of unity, of patience, of jihad not as chaos, but as order imposed upon a broken world. And there, in his court, walked a young Kurdish officer named Yusuf, quiet, studious, loyal. He watched, he learned, he remembered. In time, the West would call him Saladin. But for now, in the ruined halls of Edessa and the shattered orchards of Damascus, a new world was rising, one in which the old formulas of holy war and papal command no longer guaranteed victory. Because the fall of Edessa was no longer just about loss. It had become a turning point, a beginning masquerading as an end. And in the gathering storm of history, the West, still wounded, still blind, had no idea what was coming next. In the years that followed the failure at Damascus, the Islamic world began to shift not with sudden conquest, but with quiet conviction. Nur ad-Din, the architect of Syria's spiritual and political consolidation, became more than a commander. He was a reformer. He abolished unjust taxes, built public fountains and schools, and encouraged scholars to codify Islamic law and history. His court in Damascus became a beacon, not of opulence, but of order. And among the young men shaped by this vision was one whose name would echo far louder than any siege, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub. Still a relatively obscure figure. Saladin began his rise as part of Nur ad-Din's extended campaigns to reclaim Muslim lands not merely from the Franks, but from corrupt local emirs and remnants of fractured dynasties. What distinguished him was not just his tactical mind, but his ability to inspire loyalty, even among those who once served other flags. His quiet demeanor masked an unshakable sense of mission, a mission birthed, in part, by what Edessa had exposed. Because the fall of Edessa and the Second Crusade's failure to reclaim anything proved that Christendom, while fierce, was also fallible, that its unity was fragile, that its power was, in part, myth. And so the Muslims learned. They learned to wait, to prepare, to counter crusade, not with rage, but with calculation. In the West, however, memory distorted. Chroniclers reframed the Second Crusade not as a failure, but as a test of faith. Sermons blamed individual sin, not divine abandonment. The church, bruised but unbroken, doubled down on penance and pilgrimage. But the people remembered. They remembered the hungry marches, the bitter betrayals, the unanswered prayers, and in that silence, as kings rebuilt their courts and widows prayed alone, something deeper settled into the bones of both civilizations, a sense that the war was no longer about one city or one cause. It had become something else, a story, a cycle, a fire, one that neither side truly knew how to extinguish. By the dawn of the 1160s, the Holy Land existed in a fragile equilibrium, neither at peace nor in full war, but in a breathless interlude. Crusader fortresses still dotted the coast, but their garrisons thinned. Their knights, once lords of fear and faith, now concerned themselves more with internal squabbles, succession crises, and disputes with the local Eastern Christians whom they barely tolerated. The fire that had carried them through Antioch and Jerusalem had cooled into embers of administration, taxation, and decay. But in the East, the fire was being rekindled. Nur ad-Din's vision of a united Muslim front had begun to bear fruit through diplomacy, marriage, and occasionally the sword. He brought Aleppo, Damascus, and other key cities under a single banner. His greatest test, however, lay in Egypt, a kingdom weakened by dynastic infighting, ripe for the taking, and pivotal to the future of the entire region. The Franks, too, had their eyes on it, but it would be Nur ad-Din's general, not himself, who would take the gamble. That general was Saladin, and though few in Jerusalem had heard of him, those who did dismissed him, too young, too mild, too modest to lead an empire. But they had not seen the patience he had learned from Nur ad-Din. They had not read the scrolls he kept beside his sword. They did not understand that while the Crusaders planned fortifications, Saladin was planning generations. And so, from the broken stones of Edessa and the blood-soaked orchards of Damascus, a new war was forming not only for land, but for the soul of the world. It would not be waged by zealots alone, nor won by swords alone. It would be shaped by men who believed in destiny, men like Richard, men like Saladin, and when they met, steel would clash, but so would memory, and the ghost of Edessa silent, shattered, smouldering would still be there, watching. Years passed, but the memory of Edessa's fall and Damascus's defiance lingered in the bones of both empires. In the Latin West, songs were still sung of brave crusaders and holy vows, but they no longer rang with unshaken certainty. Behind the gold-threaded hymns lay an unease and awareness that the tide had turned, and with it, perhaps even God's favor. In cathedrals, bishops preached of renewal. They urged repentance, called for future crusades, begged for donations. But the pews were less full, the knights more reluctant, the merchants more wary. The stain of failure had seeped into the fabric of Christendom. And yet, even as the crusading spirit flickered low in the west, it surged with clarity in the east. For Nur ad-Din, the victories had not made him complacent. They had made him urgent. He saw not only opportunity, but responsibility to unite Islam. Yes, but also to purify it. His reforms stretched beyond politics. He removed corrupt officials, expanded madrasas, and encouraged the writing of history, not just as narrative, but as legacy. His court spoke not only of conquest, but of justice, and in the margins of those courts walked Saladin. He was not yet the legend, he was still the student. But each battle he witnessed, each oath he heard Nur ad-Din swear, each story of Edessa whispered in the shadows of mosque halls shaped him, sharpened him, set his path. The West, meanwhile, did not see him coming. They believed the storm had passed, that the loss of Edessa was an exception, not a beginning, that the Second Crusade was a stumble, not a slide. But history does not warn, it gathers. And while the kings of Europe turned to other matters alliances, inheritance, trade, the foundations of the next great war were being laid brick by brick in cities like Damascus, Aleppo, and eventually Cairo, because the true reckoning had not yet come, but it was riding closer with each sunset, and his name was already being spoken. Softly, reverently, Saladin. Back in the cities of Europe, the parchment pages of failure were quickly rewritten into stories of endurance. Chroniclers gilded the memory of the Second Crusade with excuses. It was not defeat, they insisted, but a test. Not abandonment, they swore, but refinement of the faithful. And so, history was not just recorded, it was curated. Kings who had marched home empty-handed still commissioned songs of valor. Queens who returned in scandal still attended mass with heads held high. The myth needed to live even if the truth had bled out in the desert. But in the East, the memory of those same events remained sharper. The Muslim world did not forget the arrogance of the Franks, the insult of their betrayals, the desecration of mosques and markets. Zengi's sword had opened a door, but Nur ad-Din had built a house on the threshold. And in that house, Saladin was learning not only how to fight, but when to forgive, when to wait, when to let others rot in their own ambition. He saw clearly what few others did, that victory would not come from vengeance alone. It would come from vision. And that vision would require not a crusade, but a counter-crusade. Not a moment of fury, but a movement of faith. So he waited. While Europe turned its gaze inward again, feuding over relics, trading indulgences, arguing about doctrine, Saladin gathered men, lands, and loyalty. The next war would not begin with a call from a pope, It would begin with a banner raised not in Rome, but in Cairo. And when it came, it would not be about reclaiming what was lost. It would be about remaking the world. And so, from Edessa's ruins to Damascus's defiance, the world shifted, but not with thunder. It shifted like the sand beneath a fortress wall, slowly, invisibly, and all at once. The Crusaders returned home changed, even if they denied it. The church turned its gaze inward, bruised but defiant, and among the ordinary faithful, those who had given sons, land, and silver to the cross, there was a quiet reckoning. They did not curse God, but they began to wonder if perhaps, just perhaps, his will was not carried on French lances or German banners. Meanwhile, in the east, the wind was different. It carried not lament, but preparation. It rustled through madrasa courtyards, across military camps in the hills of Syria, and into the darkened prayer halls of Cairo. There, the name Saladin began to echo not as a soldier, but as a symbol of unity, of piety, of destiny unfulfilled. He was still waiting, still watching, but soon he would act. And when he did, the world would remember not just Edessa, not just Damascus, but the day when the tide turned, and history no longer bent toward the west. In the vaulted libraries of Damascus, scribes copied verses not just of faith, but of vengeance shaped into vision. The ink dried over parchment that would outlive cities, recounting the rise of Zengi, the defiance of Damascus, the folly of the Franks, and in quiet corners, Saladin read. He read of betrayal, of patience, of God's justice not as thunder, but as a slow-moving river always flowing toward the sea. Far away in Europe, the memory of the Second Crusade began to erode. New kings rose, lands shifted. The church, unwilling to admit the scale of failure, leaned harder into ritual and symbolism. But beneath the incense and Latin chants, doubt lingered. Why had they failed? Had they sinned? Had they grown soft? Some turned to stricter piety, others to fear. And a few, especially those who had seen the East firsthand, began to whisper that perhaps the Muslims were not just enemies, but equals. This, more than defeat, frightened the West, and it hardened the resolve of those in the East. In the years that followed, Nur ad-Din would die, and his vision would risk collapse. But in that vacuum, Saladin would rise not merely to inherit, but to forge anew. He would unify Egypt and Syria. He would call the faithful not to revenge, but to renewal. And when Jerusalem once again became the target of armies, it would be Saladin who stood at its gates. The Crusaders would return. Yes, but this time, they would find a world prepared. For Edessa had not just fallen. It had awakened something ancient, something vast, a memory of empire, and in the shadows of fallen towers, something eternal stirred, waiting. What the West failed to see, blinded by the shimmer of its own relics and crowns, was that the loss of Edessa had triggered a renaissance not of art or commerce, but of purpose within the Islamic world. For decades, the Ummah had been fractured competing dynasties, tribal jealousies, emirs jostling for petty borders. But now, at last, a unifying thread was emerging, woven through the teachings of Nur ad-Din, and soon to be dyed red by the ambitions of his heir. Saladin's rise was not sudden. It was the slow ascent of a man who understood the value of timing. In Egypt, he first appeared as a loyal servant to Nur ad-Din. But as he consolidated power over the weakening Fatimid Caliphate, he moved with grace and caution, eliminating rivals without slaughter, gaining loyalty without bribes. Where Crusader lords squabbled over castles, Saladin rebuilt irrigation systems. Where European kings relied on divine right, Saladin earned his legitimacy through deeds, and the people watched. They saw not just a warrior, but a reformer, a man who prayed as fervently as he planned, who fasted before battle, who forgave captured enemies, even as he hardened his realm for the storm ahead. In his rule, many Muslims believed they had found what they had long been denied, a leader who mirrored the justice of the Prophet and the courage of the Rashidun. Back in the Latin kingdoms, complacency reigned. They mistook Saladin's patience for weakness. They debated over trade routes, tithe taxes, succession laws. They forgot Edessa. They forgot Damascus. Or rather, they remembered only what made them feel righteous, not what should have made them afraid. But the land remembered. Every broken wall, every orphaned family, every burned-out monastery held a memory. And in the East, those memories were being curated not in secret, but in sermons. Imams invoked Edessa not as an isolated victory, but as the first stone in a sacred foundation. If Edessa, they preached, then Aleppo. If Aleppo, then Jerusalem. It was not a question of if, only when. And so, while Western kingdoms turned their gaze inward again toward court gossip and border disputes, the East prepared, not with trumpets, but with silence. And in that silence, faith turned into steel. Maps were drawn, fortresses restored, and on the banks of the Nile and beneath the domes of Damascus, a single name gathered momentum like a storm cloud rising. Not Christ, not Caesar, but Saladin. Part 3. The crescent rises, Saladin, unity, and the road to Jerusalem. It did not begin with swords. It began with silence, deep, disciplined, and deliberate. As the West turned its back on the East, burdened by the cost of failure and lulled by temporary stability, the East began to breathe in unity. And in the eye of that gathering storm stood one man, no longer an officer, no longer a servant, but a sovereign, Saladin. He did not seize power in a burst of fire. He absorbed it. By 1171, the Fatimid Caliphate, ancient, Shia, and crumbling, was gone, dissolved not by conquest, but by care. Saladin had dismantled it brick by brick, winning the hearts of Cairo's scholars and soldiers alike. Where once Egypt had been the playground of palace coups and cultish intrigue, it now became the bedrock of revival. Sunni Islam returned to the mosques. The Friday sermons praised not a Cairo caliph, but the Abbasid caliph in Baghdad, signaling a symbolic unity across the Islamic world not seen in a generation. With Egypt under control and Syria still tethered to Nur ad-Din, Saladin did not rush. He waited. Nur ad-Din remained his mentor and nominal overlord, but the bond was uneasy. Both men knew that only one could lead the next great jihad. When Nur ad-Din died in 1174, Saladin moved swiftly, not with betrayal, but with inevitability. His claim to Syria came not through blood, but through legitimacy, backed by scholars, jurists, and the memory of Zengi's dream. The resistance was scattered. Some cities yielded, others resisted and fell. Saladin, always measured in force, gave second chances when possible, but never third. By 1176, Aleppo was encircled. By 1183, Mosul was diplomatically subdued. Damascus, once defiant, now served as Saladin's jewel, his seat of power, his gate to the world. But military conquest was not enough. Saladin understood that to truly destroy the Crusader kingdoms, he had to erase their illusion of permanence. For nearly 90 years, they had existed not just by sword, but by myth that God favored them, that their castles were invincible, that their presence in the Holy Land was a fact of nature, not history. Saladin would show them otherwise. He began not with Jerusalem, but with its lifelines. He raided supply lines, captured fortresses, reopened pilgrimage routes for Muslims. He sent emissaries to Sunni cities as far as Persia, calling for a pan-Islamic revival not just in arms, but in spirit. and slowly. The Ummah responded. Meanwhile, in the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, the rot had deepened. King Baldwin IV, brilliant, tragic, and leprous, tried desperately to hold his realm together. His body failed him, but his mind burned bright. He recognized the threat Saladin posed. He fought fiercely at Montgessar, holding back the tide, but he could not stop time. As Baldwin's health declined, so too did the unity of his court. Factions emerged. Greedy barons plotted. The infamous Reynald de Chatillon, cruel, reckless, and untouchable, raided Muslim caravans despite truce. His actions were not just criminal, they were provocations. Saladin warned him. Reynald laughed. And so the gates of war were thrown open not by strategy, but by arrogance. What followed would not be a raid, it would be a reckoning. A holy war not declared by Rome, but by Damascus. And this time, it would be Saladin who marched. The year was 1187, and the world was about to burn. Saladin had waited long enough. The balance of power had tilted. The Latin kingdom was fractured, held together not by loyalty, but by pride. King Baldwin IV, the leper king, was dead. His successor, Baldwin III, a child of fragile health, followed soon after. In the power vacuum that remained, Queen Sibylla forced the coronation of her husband, Guy of Lusignan, a French noble of middling ability and little respect. He was no match for what was coming, and Saladin knew it. But he did not strike blindly. He calculated. He called his emirs. He summoned the armies of Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia. From the hills of Kurdistan to the deserts of Arabia, warriors answered his call not just for land, not just for glory, but for jihad. This was not mere conquest, it was redemption, a holy reckoning for decades of desecration. And at the center of it all stood one name, Jerusalem. But before Jerusalem, there would be Hattin. In July of 1187, Saladin began his campaign, Reynald de Chatillon, as if inviting his own death. Once again raided a Muslim caravan, this time capturing Saladin's sister. The outrage was total. Saladin swore he would kill Reynald with his own hands. No quarter, no ransom, no forgiveness. He gathered his army near the Sea of Galilee, tens of thousands strong, bolstered by archers, cavalry, and the loyalty of tribes who had once fought each other, but now stood under one banner. The Crusaders, desperate to respond, assembled their own force under King Guy. The Templars joined, so did the Hospitallers, but it was not unity that bound them, it was panic. They marched eastward toward Tiberias, seeking to break the siege of a fortress under Muslim threat. But Saladin was ready. He poisoned wells, burned the grasslands, cut off access to the lake, and then he waited. Under the July sun, in the open hills, the Crusader army began to suffer. No water, no cover, no strategy, just heat and fear. Then, on the slopes of the Horns of Hattin, Saladin struck. His archers harassed from all sides. The Christian knights charged blindly into smoke and traps. The infantry broke. The Templars tried to rally but were overwhelmed. The royal tent fell. The true cross believed to hold a relic of Christ's crucifixion was captured. It would never be seen again. And as the sun set on July 4th, 1187, the heart of Christendom's military power in the Holy Land was shattered. Saladin walked through the field calmly. He spared King Guy out of mercy or politics. But Reynald Saladin killed him himself, as promised. No trial, no hesitation. It was not just a battle, it was a message. Jerusalem was next. And this time, no Crusader army stood in the way. The year was 1187, and the world was about to burn. Saladin had waited long enough. The balance of power had tilted. The Latin kingdom was fractured, held together not by loyalty, but by pride. King Baldwin IV, the leper king, was dead. His successor, Baldwin Vive, a child of fragile health, followed soon after. In the power vacuum that remained, Queen Sibylla forced the coronation of her husband, Guy of Lusignan, a French noble of middling ability and little respect. He was no match for what was coming, and Saladin knew it, but he did not strike blindly. He calculated, he called his emirs. He summoned the armies of Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, from the hills of Kurdistan to the deserts of Arabia. Warriors answered his call not just for land, not just for glory, but for jihad. This was not mere conquest, it was redemption, a holy reckoning for decades of desecration, and at the center of it all stood one name, Jerusalem. But before Jerusalem, there would be Hattin. In July of 1187, Saladin began his campaign, Reynald de Chatillon, as if inviting his own death. Once again raided a Muslim caravan, this time capturing Saladin's sister. The outrage was total. Saladin swore he would kill Reynald with his own hands. No quarter, no ransom, no forgiveness. He gathered his army near the Sea of Galilee, tens of thousands strong, bolstered by archers, cavalry, and the loyalty of tribes who had once fought each other, but now stood under one banner. The Crusaders, desperate to respond, assembled their own force under King Guy. The Templars joined, so did the Hospitallers. But it was not unity that bound them, it was panic. They marched eastward toward Tiberias, seeking to break the siege of a fortress under Muslim threat. But Saladin was ready. He poisoned wells, burned the grasslands, cut off access to the lake, and then he waited. Under the July sun, in the open hills. The Crusader army began to suffer. No water, no cover, no strategy, just heat and fear. Then, on the slopes of the Horns of Hattin, Saladin struck, his archers harassed from all sides. The Christian knights charged blindly into smoke and traps. The infantry broke. The Templars tried to rally but were overwhelmed. The royal tent fell. The true cross believed to hold a relic of Christ's crucifixion was captured. It would never be seen again. And as the sun set on July 4th, 1187, the heart of Christendom's military power in the Holy Land was shattered. Saladin walked through the field calmly. He spared King Guy out of mercy or politics. But Reynald Saladin killed him himself, as promised. No trial, no hesitation. It was not just a battle, it was a message. Jerusalem was next, and this time, no Crusader army stood in the way. In the weeks following the fall of Jerusalem, a strange quiet spread across the Holy Land. The dust had not yet settled, and yet the rhythm of life began to resume, shops reopening in ruined quarters, minarets echoing with new prayers, and Christian pilgrims kneeling beside Muslim guards. The siege had ended not in chaos, but in uneasy grace. Saladin did not gloat. He refused to be crowned king of Jerusalem. He ordered his soldiers to refrain from pillaging. He restored the Waqf system, appointed judges to oversee fair property transfers, and allocated rations to the city's poor, regardless of their faith. To him, conquest was not the goal. Restoration was. But beneath this fragile calm, messages were already racing westward, carried by desperate envoys, by merchant ships, by terrified clergy. In Rome, the papal court went into mourning. Pope Urban III died shortly after hearing the news, and his successor, Gregory VIII, wasted no time. Within days, he issued the bull Audita Tremendae, declaring a new crusade greater than any before. This was no longer just a war for land, it was a crusade for dignity, for redemption. In France, King Philip Augustus answered the call. In England, Richard Plantagenet, the Lionheart, took the cross with fire in his blood. Even the aged Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, prepared to march east. The kings of Europe, once distracted by internal disputes, were now united by a single humiliation: Jerusalem, back in the Levant. Saladin watched the horizon carefully. He knew what was coming. His army, though victorious, was stretched. Many emirs had returned to their regions. Supplies were thin. Fortresses remained fragile. He ordered defenses rebuilt along the coast, garrisons rotated, and scouts sent deep into Anatolia. But he also turned to diplomacy, writing to European courts, offering pilgrimage access, urging peace. He knew that, for every sword he forged, 100 more would soon cross the sea. Among his advisors, some urged preemptive strikes, others begged for negotiations. But Saladin remained poised, because he understood what few on either side could see, that this war was no longer just between nations, it was between legends. And those legends, Lionheart, Saladin, Crusade, were about to clash on a scale the world had never seen. As the ships of Europe began to launch, and the red crosses once again filled the sails, the Holy Land braced itself, for victory had come, but peace had not. But even as Saladin sat atop the summit of triumph, he knew that victory was fleeting. Power in the Holy Land was like water cupped in trembling hands, always slipping, always uncertain. The coastal cities, though stunned by Jerusalem's fall, remained defiant. Tyre held firm under Conrad of Montferrat, and Tripoli, Antioch, and the other Crusader enclaves braced for retaliation. Saladin's realm had grown too fast. What he had united by fire and faith, he now had to hold through laws, logistics, and loyalty. In Jerusalem itself, the population shifted again. Thousands of Christians who could afford ransom remained. Some converted. Others were deported. Yet remarkably, many chose to stay not out of love for Saladin, but because they recognized a truth: his justice, though foreign, was less brutal than the chaos their own leaders had brought. In time, mixed neighborhoods emerged: Muslims, Eastern Christians, and a scattering of Latin survivors trying to navigate this new order. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained open. Christian worship was permitted, though under supervision. Pilgrimage, though restricted, was not outlawed. Saladin understood the power of symbols. He did not need to destroy their faith. He only needed to reframe who truly held God's favor. Across the Islamic world, Saladin's name became legend. Poets compared him to the righteous caliphs. Scholars praised his restraint, his piety, his refusal to hoard wealth or flaunt titles. To the common man, he was the sultan who had humbled the West, reclaimed Al-Quds, and done so without drowning the city in blood. His image spread not only on coins and scrolls, but in whispered awe. But legends have a cost. For every city he held, there were 5 that could rebel. For every emir who swore loyalty, another plotted autonomy. The Byzantine Empire, still licking its wounds, began to reconsider its role. The Kingdom of Armenia repositioned its alliances. Even within Saladin's own court, rivalries festered over taxes, territory, prestige. And on the western seas, a storm was building. The Lionheart had not yet landed, but his name already cast a shadow. The Crusader kings were not traveling as pilgrims. They came with fleets, with siege engines, with banners touched by papal blessings and fueled by the rage of nations. This would not be like the First Crusade, a spontaneous miracle of desperation, nor like the Second, marred by incompetence and hubris. The Third would be different. It would be surgical, strategic, ruthless. And at its heart would be Richard of England, a man whose ambition equaled Saladin's, whose fury over Jerusalem's fall was personal, and whose legend had been forged in battle long before he ever saw the Holy Land. As Saladin stood atop Jerusalem's walls that winter, gazing westward into the wind, he may have felt something rare: doubt, not fear, never fear, but the awareness that the real test had not yet begun. Hattin had broken their armies. Jerusalem had shattered their pride, but what was coming would test their souls. By the spring of 1188, Word of Jerusalem's fall had travelled farther and deeper than any sword could reach. Monks carried the tale across frozen passes of the Alps. Minstrels sang of it in the streets of Paris, of Rome, of London. Children prayed for its return, merchants cursed the loss of trade, and knights, whether in courts or cloisters, dreamed of redemption. Europe had not merely been humiliated, it had been challenged. In England, King Henry II saw both danger and opportunity. Though old and embroiled in dynastic turmoil, he pledged funds for a new crusade. His son, Richard, already famed for his valor, went further. He vowed to lead it. Across the Channel, Philip Augustus of France, calculating and cold, also took the cross, and in Germany, the aged Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, legend in his own right, summoned the imperial hosts one last time. This was no longer just a crusade. It was a coalition of kings. And it came with innovations. A special tax, the Saladin tithe, was imposed across England and France. Even clergy paid. Ships were built en masse. Contracts with Genoese and Venetian fleets were signed. Siege engines were designed in advance. Unlike before, the West now prepared not just spiritually, but scientifically, logistically. Saladin watched all this unfold with wary respect. He knew what was coming. He sent envoys, offered truces, proposed prisoner exchanges. But the West was no longer listening. They were not coming for peace. They were coming to reclaim a myth. And so Saladin reinforced the coastal defenses, fortified Acre, Jaffa, Ascalon, ordered fresh levies from the Euphrates to the Nile, rearranged alliances with wary emirs. And above all, he waited. Because he knew what most did not. The next war would not be won by one man or one battle. It would be a war of endurance. As summer drew near, the Crusader fleets began to move. And across the Holy Land, one phrase echoed from cathedral to mosque. From tent to throne, Jerusalem must be avenged. But fate, ever cruel, would test both sides in ways they never imagined. And neither Saladin nor Richard would emerge from it untouched. As the fleets of the West set sail, carrying thousands of armored knights, horses, siege weapons, and the fire of vengeance, a silence descended over the Levant. It was not the silence of peace, but of anticipation. The kind that lingers before thunder. In Acre, the port city that had become the gateway to the Holy Land, the garrisons drilled day and night. Merchants packed their wares. Spies scurried through taverns, and common folk, Muslim, Christian, and Jew alike, waited with dread. For they knew what was coming would not be like the last war. It would be worse. It would be calculated. Saladin reinforced the city's defenses personally. He visited every key fortress on the coast, appointed loyal generals, and ordered food and water stockpiled. He reorganized supply chains from Egypt and Syria. His letters to distant allies no longer spoke of conquest, but of survival. But for all his caution, he remained unshaken. Because Saladin understood something deeper. This war was not only over land, it was over narrative. Who had God favored? Who had history chosen? Richard of England would soon arrive not merely as a king, but as a symbol. And Saladin, already a legend, would now have to defend that legend not only with steel, but with spirit. Meanwhile, across the sea, the journey was anything but smooth. Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, old but unbent, led his German army overland through the Balkans and Anatolia. But in 1190, disaster struck. He drowned while crossing a river in Cilicia. His death shattered morale. Many Germans turned back. Only a remnant reached the Levant. In contrast, Philip Augustus and Richard the Lionheart journeyed by sea separately, warily, already mistrustful. Their alliance was one of convenience, not brotherhood. In Sicily, tensions flared. In Cyprus, Richard seized control of the island after a dispute with its Byzantine ruler. an act that both secured a crucial base and showcased his fury. By the time Richard finally reached Acre in 1191, the city had been under siege for over 2 years. Crusader forces had surrounded it. Saladin's army had surrounded them in turn. Disease and death haunted both lines. No side had broken the stalemate. Then Richard arrived, and everything changed. He brought with him not just troops, but energy. His presence electrified the exhausted Crusaders. He took command of the siege lines, coordinated assaults, and brought massive new trebuchets capable of hurling boulders the size of cattle. His tactics were brilliant, his temper terrifying. Inside Acre, Saladin's garrison fought valiantly, but the pressure was too great. On July 12th, 1191, Acre surrendered. It was a moment that should have marked hope. Instead, it marked horror. Nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners, soldiers, women, children were held for ransom. Negotiations dragged. Saladin delayed perhaps to gather gold, perhaps to stall. Richard, frustrated and furious, gave the order. On August 20th, the prisoners were marched out of the city and slaughtered, beheaded, speared, shot. Saladin watched helplessly from nearby hills. He had never ordered such a thing. He had never done such a thing. And from that day on, the war changed. It was no longer just about Jerusalem. It was about justice, about revenge. And as the desert winds howled over the bloodied fields outside Acre, 2 men stood on opposite sides of history, each certain of his cause, each certain of his righteousness, the Lionheart and the Sultan. Their war had only just begun, and the world held its breath. The Siege of Acre did not end the war. It only reshaped it. As the gates fell and the Crusaders poured in, the city was a corpse hollowed by starvation, disease, and the grinding despair of years under siege. The air reeked of death, of rotting grain, of broken stone. The Muslim defenders who survived were chained, their children separated, their fate held ransom not by hope, but by negotiation. Saladin, though still commanding a powerful army nearby, chose not to risk a full-scale battle to break the siege. It was a pragmatic decision, strategically sound, but it came at a price. For many Muslims, especially those whose families had perished in the massacre, the image of the Sultan watching from the hills as 3,000 innocents were executed became a scar, a memory etched into the soul of a generation. And for Saladin, it was personal. He had fought wars. He had issued death sentences. But what Richard had done at Acre was not war. It was a spectacle. A statement. A demonstration of cold, righteous fury designed to terrify. It worked. But it also hardened Saladin. No longer would he attempt to bargain with Richard. No longer would he send emissaries bearing wine, fruit, or terms of truce. The Sultan, who had once been famed for mercy, now spoke of vengeance not with rage, but with resolve. Yet war was more than emotions. It was attrition. From Acre, the Crusader army marched south toward Jaffa, hugging the coastline where their fleet could supply them. Richard led from the front, his command decisive, brutal, effective. His army was a machine of discipline. He rode alongside the Templars and Hospitallers, and his standard, a crimson cross on white, became a symbol that struck fear across the hills. Saladin harassed the march constantly. His cavalry circled like jackals, striking at water-bearers, picking off scouts, torching fields. But Richard did not break formation. He kept his infantry in tight columns. He rotated rear guards. He ensured the men rested, fed, and prayed. Then came Arsuf. On September 7th, 1191, near the forests north of Jaffa, Saladin launched a full-scale assault. His troops thundered out of the trees with cries of Allahu Akbar, arrows darkening the sky. The rearguard Hospitallers took the brunt. They begged Richard to allow a countercharge. He held firm. Timing was everything. One misstep, and the army would splinter. Then, at the perfect moment, he gave the signal. The charge of the Crusader cavalry at Arsuf was thunder incarnate. They hit the Muslim lines like a hammer forged in God's own furnace. Saladin's men, caught off guard by the sudden discipline and ferocity, broke formation. Chaos rippled through the field. Richard personally led the vanguard, cutting through enemy ranks, his sword a blur, his armor gleaming with blood and dust. Saladin, seeing his lines buckle, ordered a retreat not in shame, but in survival. The Crusaders had won a decisive victory, but it was not enough. Richard pressed to Jaffa, reinforced its defenses, and began contemplating a march on Jerusalem. But winter was near. Supplies grew thin. His army was exhausted. And Saladin, though bruised, had not been beaten. He regrouped quickly, replacing losses, drawing reinforcements from Damascus and Mosul. The path to Jerusalem remained open, but not easy. Richard advanced inland, reaching within sight of the holy city. But storms came. Mud choked the roads. Scouts brought word that Saladin had reinforced the hills and dug trenches along the passes. Richard hesitated. A siege in winter would doom his army. A capture without ability to hold would be meaningless. Twice he advanced, twice he withdrew. The army murmured. Knights who had sailed across the world to retake Jerusalem now stood in her shadow, only to watch Golden Dome glint in silence. Untaken. Pilgrims wept. Priests cursed. Some began to whisper that the Lionheart's courage had faded. But Richard knew the truth. Victory was not just about banners and gates. It was about legacy. And he would not stain his name in the snow outside Jerusalem. Instead, he struck elsewhere, retaking coastal cities, building fortresses, capturing castles. He waged war not with grandeur, but with pressure. And Saladin, though never routed, began to bend. His troops were exhausted, his coffers drained. His empire, stretched thin, cracked under its own brilliance. By 1192, both men knew the truth. Neither could destroy the other. They met not face to face, but through envoys, and agreed to the Treaty of Jaffa. Christians would hold the coast. Pilgrims would be allowed to visit Jerusalem unarmed. A fragile peace, drawn not from triumph, but fatigue. And so the Lionheart sailed home hailed in ballads, yet shadowed by a city he had not taken. And Saladin returned to Damascus not defeated, but diminished. The sword of Islam, now weary, laid down his blade. He would die months later, his treasury empty, his name eternal. Their war had ended, but the fire they lit would burn for centuries. Even as the ink dried on the Treaty of Jaffa, the lands between Jaffa and Jerusalem did not exhale. The soil was too soaked in blood, the sky too used to screams. This was not peace, it was pause. A fragile truce drawn not from trust, but from exhaustion. Richard remained only briefly. He had left behind a fractured kingdom in England, where his brother John schemed and Philip Augustus of France sharpened his ambitions. But more than politics, it was something deeper that drove the Lionheart home. He had come to reclaim Jerusalem. He had not done so. To some, he had failed. But Richard did not see it that way. He had preserved the Crusader states, opened pilgrimage routes, and shattered Saladin's aura of invincibility at Arsuf and Jaffa. He had faced down the greatest Muslim leader of the age and left the battlefield unbeaten. That, to him, was enough. But history is rarely kind to compromise. In taverns and monasteries across Europe, songs were sung of glory, but also of questions. Why had Richard turned back from the walls of Jerusalem? Why had he spared Saladin when vengeance had burned so hot? Some said he lacked faith. Others claimed he feared death. But the truth was simpler. He feared losing more than he could afford. Meanwhile, Saladin's empire began to shake. He had united a vast territory, from Egypt to Syria, from Arabia to Mesopotamia. But his rule was personal, not institutional. With his death, There would be no clear successor. His sons, brothers, and generals would divide the realm. Civil wars would follow. The dream of a unified Islamic resistance to the Crusaders would fade. And yet, Saladin's legacy endured. In Europe, even among his enemies, his name became legend. Chroniclers described him as noble, just, and merciful, a king of honor, not hatred. His image appeared in ballads, sermons, even poems of courtly love. To Christians, he was the ideal enemy, a worthy foe who made the Crusades seem like an epic duel between titans, not the chaotic and brutal slaughter they often were. And in the Muslim world, Saladin became something more, a symbol of resistance, a memory of unity, a whisper that perhaps, one day, another would rise like him, righteous, brave, and just, and reclaim not only Jerusalem, but dignity. The Third Crusade ended not with triumph or tragedy, but with tension unresolved. The Latin states survived, barely. The Muslim frontier held, bloodied but unbeaten. And somewhere in the dust, amid broken shields and broken promises, the seeds of future wars took root. For as long as Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, the dream of another crusade would never die. And as long as Europeans believed that glory lay eastward, the ships would continue to sail. The Siege of Acre, the march to Jaffa, the Battle at Arsuf. These were not just events. They were chapters in a larger book, a book written not in ink, but in fire. A book still unfinished, and so they left the Holy Land. These kings of fire and thunder. Richard, captured on his journey home, would spend years in captivity, ransomed at a ruinous price, his kingdom weakened by absence, his legend inflated by ballads sung more loudly than facts could whisper. He would die young, pierced by a crossbow bolt in a war that had nothing to do with Jerusalem, not on holy ground, but in mud and politics, far from the city he had sworn to save. Saladin, worn thin by war and diplomacy, would die not long after. His funeral procession revealed a man who had given away all his riches. He left behind no gold, no vault, no sprawling palace, only a sword, a Quran, and a name that echoed in every mosque from Marrakesh to Mosul. When they opened his closet, they found a note he had dictated before death: "I own nothing, not even the cost of my own burial. 2 lions, 2 legacies. The Third Crusade, despite all its glory and carnage, changed little on the map. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control. The Crusader states held a sliver of coastline. No great empire fell. No new kingdom rose. And yet, something had shifted. In the minds of men, the war had transcended land. It had become myth. 1,000 years later, children in both East and West would still speak the names Richard and Saladin, not because they were perfect, but because they symbolized something greater: honor, courage, faith, conflict, the very best and worst of what humans could become. And that was the truest legacy of Acre, Jaffa, Arsuf, and Jerusalem, not the blood in the dust, but the memory in the soul. The fall and the fury, what victory cost. It was not the fall of a city that echoed loudest. It was the silence that followed. Jerusalem remained unconquered by Christian hands. Richard had sailed home, triumphant in tactics, but defeated in purpose. Saladin had died, not as a conqueror enthroned, but as a weary servant of God, leaving behind an empire already fraying at the edges. And yet, the war had changed everything. Across Europe, the bards sang of the Lionheart. Churches rang bells for the Crusaders who never returned. Merchants told tales of Acre's fall, of Saladin's mercy, of the shining towers of the East that seemed more myth than masonry. Children reenacted battles in muddy fields, chanting the names of kings they had never seen. but the glory masked a darker truth. The cost of the crusade was not counted in land or gold. It was counted in shattered lives, in empty homes, in a bitterness that did not die with the dead. Thousands had marched for God. Few returned whole, some returned broken in spirit. Others, forever changed by what they saw, by what they did, and by what they failed to achieve. In Acre, the city rebuilt but never truly healed. Its walls were mended, its ports reopened. But beneath the new stones, the bones of the fallen still lay buried. Muslim and Christian, soldier and child, martyr and murderer. The city became a crucible of tension, part kingdom, part powder keg. The Christian barons who remained argued over titles, trade, and tithes. The Knights Templar and Hospitallers gained enormous power, answering not to kings, but to Rome. The local population, Greek Orthodox, Arab Christians, Jews, Muslims, lived in a fragile web of rules, taxes, and unspoken grudges. Peace had come, but it was not trust, and it would not last. In the grand halls of Europe, the news of the Treaty of Jaffa was met with mixed silence and strained smiles. On parchment, it seemed a victory-safe pilgrimage routes, fortified crusader holdings, and a tenuous peace with the Sultan of the East. But in the hearts of those who had given all for the cross, it rang hollow. Jerusalem, that golden heart of Christian yearning, still lay in the hands of Islam. The Pope declared the campaign a necessary success. Chronicles recorded it as a temporary truce ordained by God. But in the streets, people whispered different truths. Mothers wept for sons lost in the desert. Taxpayers grumbled about the Saladin tithe, which had drained the lifeblood from towns and parishes. Monks began to question not only the failure of the crusade, but the silence of heaven itself. Was it God's will they had failed, or had they never truly listened in the Holy Land? Richard's absence left a vacuum. With no strong central command, the remaining Crusader states fractured. Lords schemed, Venetians and Genoese clashed over ports, the Templars acted like kings, and Muslim leaders, seeing Saladin's empire split between heirs, circled like vultures over a wounded lion. The peace signed in 1192 was never meant to last. It was a ceasefire carved by exhaustion, not conviction. Saladin's sons bickered over Damascus and Cairo. Richard's successors in England showed little interest in returning east. The Kingdom of Jerusalem still existed in name, but its capital was not Jerusalem. It was Acre. Acre, a city built on the bones of martyrs, ruled by a court of suspicion, and defended by men who had known nothing but war. Here, in the tangled alleys of trade and shadowed chapels, the real aftermath of the Third Crusade took root. Religious orders ran hospitals, yet executed spies. Latin priests preached redemption, yet charged fees to the poor. Muslim traders returned under treaty, but were taxed and watched. Marriages between faiths were forbidden. Yet brothels flourished behind church walls. And in the silence of night, stories spread. Stories of children taken in raids, of relics lost or faked, of saints who had wept blood after Jerusalem was spared. In Europe, the myth of the Crusade endured. Ballads told of Richard's duels, Saladin's mercy, and the shining ideal of a righteous war. But the veterans knew the truth. There had been no righteousness, only blood, only mud, only men sent to die by other men who would never see the battlefield. In one village in Normandy, an old knight was asked why he no longer attended Mass. He stared into the fire and answered, "Because I saw God in the eyes of the man I killed, and I don't know what he saw in mine." The crusade had forged legends, but it had shattered faith. And so, as peace settled over the Levant like dust over a battlefield, both sides began to build anew, not out of hope, but out of necessity. Fortresses were repaired, markets reopened, scholars resumed teaching, But beneath every stone, there was the memory of what had been taken and what had never truly been won. Across the fractured plains of the Holy Land, the scars of war were no longer red. They were grey, baked into the soil, etched into stone. A pilgrim might walk the road from Tyre to Jaffa and see rebuilt churches and bustling ports. Yet behind each wall was a tale of betrayal, a face that remembered, a silence that accused. In the east, Saladin's passing had splintered what he had so carefully unified. His empire, though vast, was never meant to be eternal. His sons, lacking his vision and discipline, divided Syria and Egypt among themselves. Rivalries emerged. Emirs once bound by his charisma now built personal fiefdoms, fortifying cities against each other, even as the Crusader states still lurked on the coast like embers refusing to die. In the west, Richard's legend only grew with his absence. Though he had failed to retake Jerusalem, songs did not tell of hesitation. They told of a hero who struck fear into the heart of the East. His exploits became myth, the king who tore down city walls, who cut through armies like parchment, who faced Saladin as an equal. And like all myths, the man disappeared into shadow. He died not in battle, but in a skirmish far from glory. Yet his name outlived him on banners, in cathedrals, in childhood fantasies of crusading glory. But glory had lost its meaning. The true cost of the Third Crusade was not counted in borders redrawn or cities lost and won. It was in the soul of Christendom, now divided not only from Islam, but from within itself. The Orthodox Church, long wary of Latin ambition, had seen once more the Western hunger for control. Jewish communities across Europe, already scapegoated, had faced massacres in the fervor whipped up by crusading zeal. The Church, though enriched by lands and gold pledged in vows, began to fray. Some monks spoke of divine punishment for pride, others whispered of corruption. Crusading indulgences, once rare and sacred, were now granted too easily for coin, for loyalty, for political favor. And ordinary people, those who had buried sons, sold farms, watched preachers ride by on silk saddles, began to doubt. Was Jerusalem worth this? Did God truly demand this blood? Was the cross, once a symbol of redemption, now just a banner for war in Acre, which now served as the de facto capital of the Latin East? A quiet paranoia settled. The fortifications were improved, but the people were restless. New waves of settlers arrived from Europe, idealists, adventurers, mercenaries, but many left within months, disillusioned by the heat, the tension, the subtle feeling that they were living on borrowed time. Templars and Hospitallers held their fortresses like miniature kingdoms. Their loyalty was no longer to crown or city, but to their own rule, their own codes. They negotiated with Muslim emirs when it suited them. They waged secret wars over relics and tribute. And the papacy, far away, either turned a blind eye or found itself helpless to intervene. Meanwhile, Muslim chroniclers, men who had once described the Crusaders as beasts and barbarians, now wrote with a strange respect. They told of Richard's courage, of the Crusaders' skill in siege and defense, but they also wrote of madness, of strange rituals, of soldiers who believed dying in sand would earn paradise. They did not understand, but neither did the West. For both civilizations had looked into the same fire, and each had seen something different. To one, it was a test of endurance. To the other, a prophecy denied. And beneath it all, the flame still burned. Quietly, waiting. Years passed, and the dust of the Third Crusade slowly settled. But like ash from a long-dead fire, it coated everything. The cities rebuilt. Trade resumed. Treaties were signed and broken. But something vital had shifted beneath the surface, something in the hearts of men. Europe, once ablaze with crusading fervor, began to waver. The common folk who had sold land, pledged sons, emptied churches of gold had grown weary. Their bishops still preached of the holy duty, but the pews were quieter. Fewer knights took the cross. Pilgrimage continued. Yes, but crusade. Crusade was beginning to taste like a lie. Meanwhile, in the Levant, a different fatigue set in. Muslim communities, though victorious in battle, bore the burden of constant vigilance. Every caravan was watched. Every letter from Cairo or Mosul might carry news of rebellion or invasion. The unity Saladin had forged began to unravel. His heirs bickered. Strong men rose in different cities, declaring loyalty with one hand and sharpening blades with the other. And Jerusalem remained the eye of the storm. Though still in Muslim hands, it stood strangely aloof. Saladin had permitted Christian pilgrims to visit. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained open. Latin monks sang mass under armed guards. The dome of the rock gleamed in the sun, as it always had. But the city was now both symbol and scar, claimed by many, owned by none. In Rome, the papacy knew the balance could not hold. Another crusade would be needed. Another call. Another wave of redemption through steel. Plans began to form. Letters were sent. Funds were gathered. But the people were changing. The myth of the righteous crusade had cracked. Not vanished, but no longer untouchable. Too many had died. Too little had been gained. Too many who returned spoke not of glory, but of hunger, betrayal, and the madness of war. And yet, the seed remained, in whispered sermons, in embroidered banners tucked away in noble homes, in the eyes of children who listened to tales of Richard and Saladin by firelight, their hearts stirred not by faith, but by adventure. Because memory is not just what we inherit, it's what we choose to believe. And though the Third Crusade had ended with treaties, walls, and weariness, its story had only just begun. It became the template, the reference, the legend, a legend of two kings, of a city, of a cross, and of a sword. The city of Acre, now the heart of the Crusader presence in the East, became a paradox. A Christian kingdom built on Muslim soil, defended by mercenaries, ruled by divided lords, and sustained by trade with the very enemies it had once sworn to destroy. In its markets, you could find Venetian silk beside Damascus steel. Templars walked side by side with Arab translators. Latin priests shared bread with Eastern Christians. And somewhere, between whispers of saints and the clinking of coins, people began to forget what the war was even about. But the war had not forgotten them. Because although the swords were sheathed, the ideologies had not died. If anything, they had hardened. Crusader and Saracen no longer saw each other as mere rivals, but as reflections of divine judgment. Each side had tasted both victory and restraint, cruelty and mercy, and had come away convinced of its own righteousness. And so the war lived on. Not in siege towers or cavalry charges, but in chronicles, in schools, in pulpits and minbars. Theologians debated whether the land could ever truly belong to one side. Poets wrote of divine signs, stars falling over Acre, blood that would not wash from stone. And pilgrims who came to pray often left with sharper questions than when they arrived. Some wondered if both Richard and Saladin had shown honor, if both had sought peace when war failed. Then why had their followers learned only how to fight back in Europe? The legacy of the Crusade became something to inherit. Kings used it to justify new taxes, new claims. Nobles who had never crossed the Mediterranean suddenly called themselves Crusaders for local wars against heretics, pagans, even political rivals. The cross, once a symbol of sacrifice, now hung above courts, battlefields, and coinage as a seal of divine right. In the Muslim world, Saladin's name was carved into the very idea of just leadership. His story became a mirror to future rulers. His refusal to massacre Jerusalem's Christians was held up as the gold standard of moral warfare. And yet, even among his own people, there were doubts. Could such mercy survive a world so drenched in betrayal? The answer came not in words, but in silence. For years after the Treaty of Jaffa, there were no large crusades. No new kings landed on Levantine shores. But everyone waited. The Templars drilled. The ports bristled with new defenses. Spies crossed borders. And in every major city from Antioch to Acre, from Cairo to Damascus, the question remained: when would the next war begin? Because no one believed the peace would last. It never had. And still, Jerusalem stood, unbroken, unclaimed, watching, like a mirror held up to all who dared call themselves holy. For the Crusaders, the dream had always been simple: reclaim the city where Christ had walked. Restore the sacred to Christian hands. Fulfill a divine vow. But in the end, what they reclaimed was not a city, but a myth, one that would haunt every crusade to come. For the Muslims, the Third Crusade proved that even the might of kings could not crush their faith or break their lands. But it also reminded them of their fragility, of how close the edge always was, and how much depended on men like Saladin, who would not always be there. In the ashes of war, something else remained, a question, not of ownership, but of meaning. What does it mean to fight for the sacred? What happens when sacredness becomes a banner beneath which men kill, steal, betray? And what becomes of a city when the world decides it is worth dying for, over and over again? The Third Crusade did not answer these questions. It only sharpened them. It passed them down to future crusades, to future empires, to us. And so the tale ends not with a triumph, nor with a tragedy, but with a silence that hangs over Jerusalem like dusk. Not peace, not war, but something older, something deeper. The memory of men who tried to take heaven by force and failed, long after the banners were lowered and the swords dulled with rust. The memory of the Third Crusade remained, not in the charred stones of Acre or the untouched gates of Jerusalem, but in the hearts of those who had lived through it and in the imaginations of those who had not. Children born a generation later would hear stories not of blood and blisters, but of valor and vision. Richard the Lionheart became a knight without flaw. Saladin, a sultan without peer. Their humanity was stripped away, replaced by archetype and legend. The messy truths of diplomacy, hesitation, betrayal, and slaughter were forgotten or rewritten, molded to fit sermons, poems, and patriotic songs. But for those who had marched under the sun of the Levant, who had buried brothers beneath foreign skies, who had stared at the golden dome of Jerusalem and known they would never touch its stones, there was no forgetting. They returned home changed, or not at all. Some could not speak of what they had seen. Others spoke too often, seeking in repetition a meaning that would not come. A few renounced violence. Others joined monasteries, or drifted to the edge of towns, whispering prayers in languages their neighbours did not understand. The church, though victorious in image, had been wounded in soul. The myth of divine infallibility had cracked, and behind it lay the uncomfortable truth that human ambition, not divine will, had driven many of the decisions, alliances, and betrayals. Yet still, new crusades would come, not because the past had succeeded, but because it had inspired. The story of Jerusalem had become too powerful. It was no longer a city. It was a symbol, and symbols, once born, cannot be buried. So the wheel turned. Crusade followed crusade. Blood soaked into sand. Treaties were signed and shattered. And through it all, Jerusalem endured, silent, waiting, watching. Because in the end, no army ever truly conquered the Holy Land. It conquered them, and that was the final cost. The war had ended, but the land had not healed. In the Holy Land, life resumed not in triumph, but in necessity. Markets reopened, ships sailed, harvests were sown. Yet beneath every routine beat the pulse of unease. A child playing in the alleyways of Acre might run past a wall pockmarked by catapults. A merchant in Jaffa might still bear scars from the siege. A priest delivering mass in a rebuilt chapel might pause, remembering the silence that followed each scream. People moved on, but memory clung like dust. Crusaders who had stayed behind those who had not returned to Europe formed a strange new society. Some married locals. Some became mercenaries. Others simply vanished into the cities of the East, their identities slowly dissolving into the cultures around them. A few even converted not from treachery, but from disillusionment, from a search for peace the cross had never delivered. And in Europe, the echoes grew softer but never died. Crusade preachers still roamed from town to town. Kings still whispered of holy campaigns to rally support for their wars. The Pope still blessed swords, and in every cathedral, there was always one corner, one carving, one fresco of the Holy City, radiant in gold leaf, untouched by history. But beneath that gold, the rot had begun. The idea of holy war had opened a door that would not close. What had started as a march for salvation had become a cycle of conquest, fear, and control. And the more it was justified by heaven, the more monstrous it became. So ended the Third Crusade, not in fire, not in glory, but in a question still unanswered. When faith becomes a weapon, who bears the wound? The answer, perhaps, still lies in the dust of Acre, in the hills beyond Jerusalem, in the hearts of those who still look east, not with swords, but with sorrow. And so, the cross and the crescent watched one another from across the ages, not as enemies, but as mirrors. The legacy of the Third Crusade was not simply one of campaigns and treaties, it was psychological. It crept into the dreams of monarchs, the theology of monks, and the paranoia of cities that feared both invasion and disillusionment. For all its grandeur, the war had not purified the world. It had complicated it. It had exposed the fragility of empires, the contradictions of holy war, and the terrifying ease with which righteousness could become cruelty. In the ports of the Mediterranean, crusader ships carried home not just soldiers, but ideas twisted by hardship and grief. Pilgrims who had journeyed east in search of relics or redemption returned speaking in new tongues, wearing foreign silks, and bearing stories that unsettled the church. Some had seen Muslim charity. Others had questioned the motives of Christian kings. More than one whispered, in confession or in wine, that the enemy had sometimes looked more Christ-like than the Crusaders themselves. These were dangerous thoughts. And so, the church doubled down. It reinforced orthodoxy, tightened control, preached with renewed vigor that the Holy Land must be reclaimed. But the more it insisted, the more cracks began to show. Heresies flared in Europe among the Cathars in the south of France, among mystics and scholars who asked too many questions. And always, behind the threat of heresy, loomed the spectre of failure. Jerusalem still stood, untouched. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, Saladin's death marked the beginning of a different fragmentation. His empire had never been truly unified. It was held together by loyalty to his character, not a constitution. His successors quarreled. Some made peace with the Crusaders, others plotted their removal. Still others looked inward, weary of endless war. For ordinary Muslims, the victory had brought no prosperity. The land remained scarred, the economy unstable, the borderlands restless. And yet, in both East and West, the Crusade endured not as a military effort, but as myth. Richard and Saladin became more than men. They became archetypes. Richard, the fearless paladin, undeterred even in defeat. Saladin, the noble adversary, dignified in victory. They were invoked by poets, generals, popes, and sultans alike. And as decades passed, their images were refined, polished, politicized. Richard was turned into a model of chivalric kingship, Saladin into the epitome of Islamic virtue. That neither man was so simple mattered little. Because history, once turned into legend, is no longer obliged to tell the truth. And that, perhaps, was the final cost of the Third Crusade. Not the loss of Jerusalem, not the blood spilled on Acre's stones, but the replacement of painful memory with convenient myth. A war of chaos and compromise became a story of destiny and glory. And in that story, the lessons were lost. The weeping widow, the starving child, the knight who wept after battle, the monk who doubted his vow, the scribe who buried the truth beneath a more heroic line. Their voices faded not in silence, but in substitution. And so, from Acre's broken gates to Rome's gilded altars, from Damascus to Dover, the world moved on, but never unscarred. And so it ends, not with the clash of swords or the tolling of victory bells, but with a question whispered across centuries. Was it worth it? The Third Crusade left no victor, only survivors, no holy triumph, only haunted cities, Jerusalem, untouched but changed forever, Acre, rebuilt upon ruin, and hearts, millions of hearts across empires marked by longing, by loss, by a war that promised heaven and delivered ash. It began with fire in the soul, with kings on their knees, with banners held high beneath storm-racked skies. It ended with silence, with uneasy truces, with legends that dulled the pain but could not erase it. Richard the Lionheart returned to a fractured kingdom. Saladin died with no coin to pay for his burial, and Jerusalem remained what it had always been, not a prize, but a mirror. A mirror that shows what men become when they mistake conquest for faith, vengeance for righteousness, and war for salvation. And yet, the world remembered, not just the pain, but the poetry, not just the cruelty, but the courage, not just the fall, but the stand. For in every ruined chapel, every broken spear buried beneath centuries of dust, there is still a heartbeat, faint, defiant, enduring. A reminder that what we fight for says more about who we are than what we win.